When talking about the Detroit Lions wide receiving core, everybody talks about Amon-Ra St. Brown, the All-Pro. Everybody talks about Jameson Williams, the former 12th overall pick. Everybody talks about Donovan Peoples-Jones, the offense's most recent trade acquisition. Everybody talks about Khalif Raymond, the guy that kind of kicked off this wide receiving core and is really the veteran of the group. But nobody ever talks about Antoine Green, the second-year player from North Carolina, is a player with a lot of physical gifts, a ton of gifted traits, and a player that I think long-term could be a super valuable asset for a Detroit Lions offense that is still lacking an X-wide receiver. Now, Antoine Green as a prospect came out of North Carolina standing at 6'1", 199 pounds. He graded out with an 8.68 RAS score and was one of those project players that had the height, weight, speed, but was lacking a little bit in the technique, in the nuances of playing the wide receiver position. Now, throughout his RAS score, Antoine Green graded out with just okay explosiveness and okay agility, but really good speed, running a 4.47 and having great splits for a wide receiver of his size and weight. Now, Antoine Green played 5 years at North Carolina, and although his career got off to a very slow start, he did have a couple of flashes. As in his sophomore year, he averaged over 27.1 yards per reception, but really wasn't productive and really wasn't consistently productive until his senior season and really the last 2 seasons of his collegiate career. Now, in 2021, Antoine Green played in 13 games for the Tar Heels, where he totaled 31 receptions for 612 yards and 5 touchdowns, while averaging 19.7 yards per reception. Now, the volume wasn't necessarily there for Antoine Green. He was always the second or the third option with other guys like Josh Downs in front of him. But in 13 games, 31 receptions, that's about 2.5 catches per game. And again, when you're averaging nearly 20 yards per reception, you're going to be able to stretch the field and do quite a bit of damage with every touch that you receive, even if you aren't getting more than 3 to 4 receptions a game. Now, in 2022, Antoine Green took a step forward. He was more productive and more consistent, as in just 9 games with the Tar Heels in 2022. He had 43 receptions for 789 yards, 7 touchdowns, and averaged 18.6 yards per reception. So while his efficiency technically went down, his volume went way up, and he had more receptions, more yards, and more touchdowns. And you would argue that in a 13-game season, if he did play all 13 games for the Tar Heels again, he would have been pushing about 1,000 yards while still not really being considered the number one option as far as volume or targets go. Now, Antoine Green is a big play threat. He is explosive. He shows flashes. And even in the preseason last year, he was a player that we saw a lot of good from, but also a little bit of bad. His consistency isn't really there. But again, it makes up for with the big plays, with the explosiveness, with the ability to take the top off of a defense. And the flashes that are shown are flashes that will impress you over and over and over again. Now, Antoine Green eventually went on to be the 7th round pick for the Detroit Lions in 2023. He was the 219th overall selection, and many people believe that Antoine Green probably wasn't going to make the roster, but was going to be a good camp body and was a guy that was probably going to have a fairly decent preseason. Now, Antoine Green showed flashes in camp. He showed inconsistencies, but also showed some really big wow factor ability. His routes were inconsistent, his hands were inconsistent, and he did struggle with the physicality at the NFL level, even being pressed by guys like Cam Sutton and Jerry Jacobs, right? Even with our poor secondary a year ago, Antoine Green struggled with the physicality, struggled with his consistency while running routes, and did have some drop issues throughout minicamp. However, going into the preseason, Antoine Green was super impressive, having 3 games under his belt, being targeted 8 times, having 7 catches for 151 yards and a touchdown with a long of 70 yards. Now, you might think that those statistics are a little bit inflated due to that 70-yard touchdown reception, but that still means outside of that, he was targeted 7 times, had 6 receptions for well over 80 yards, meaning he was averaging about, 8 to 10 yards per reception in the preseason. So he was very consistent in the preseason, caught almost every ball that was thrown his way, and had over 150 yards and a single touchdown through 3 games, while again, not being the guy that gets the most volume to targets, but making the most of every single play. So After his strong preseason, Antoine Green did make the roster as the Lions' final wide receiver, but didn't see very much playing time. He did get a couple of snaps here and there, and actually did have a screen pass that he took for 2 yards versus the Seattle Seahawks in week 2. However, that would be the only reception that Antoine Green saw his rookie season. Now, when talking about Antoine Green, Dan Campbell has a lot of very good things to say, but also a couple of not so promising things to say. Right. He started off one of his conferences by talking about Antoine Green this preseason, saying, hey, man, he does some things that really show. And then it just, it dips. Then there it is again. He's a young player, and Dan Campbell goes on to say that he's a young player and he makes mistakes, and that when he's on and when he makes those wild plays, it makes you really think that this is a guy that you could rely on to be your X wide receiver. But then, he turns around and he drops a simple slant route. He drops a simple comeback. He's late on the curl. He's late on the, cut to break inside. And while Antoine Green flashes that fantastic potential, the consistency just was never really there last year for Antoine Green, which is exactly why he failed to really see the field very much. He also said, Dan Campbell said, that he does some things that really catch your eye and then some things the opposite way. So he's inconsistent right now. And the more he can, he says the more that he can, he lessens the inconsistencies, the better off he's going to be. Now, obviously, that just means that when Antoine Green can catch the ball a little more consistency, can hit his routes a little more precise, he's going to be a threat that Dan Campbell and Ben Johnson really believe can help this roster and help this receiving core. Antoine Green has all of the physical capabilities to be a top player in this league. Antoine Green has the size at 6'1", 200 pounds. He has the speed running about a 4.47 and being right around that mid 4.4 range for a guy of his size. He can stretch the field just like we saw in the preseason on that 70-yard reception versus the Carolina Panthers. The flashes again in the preseason were certainly there, where he made a couple fantastic catches, made a couple fantastic plays after the catch. All of it was there. And if you watch the film of every reception Antoine Green had, you would say that Antoine Green was probably a player that the Lions could rely on a little bit more. He has a flair for the spectacular. He's a guy that's going to make big, flashy plays. But then you're going to look at the rest of the tape and say, okay, well, look at all the plays where Antoine Green wasn't targeted. It's because he wasn't able to get open. He wasn't able to create separation. He didn't run the cleanest route, or he had a drop here and there, especially in camp, that led to the quarterbacks not trusting him as much. Antoine Green is a very interesting player, right? He's a guy that, again, has all of this potential, but is seeming to struggle with a lot of the finite details. In 2024, we haven't heard very much about Antoine Green. No news, no minicamp news, no OTA news, has not been making splashes and has not been making flashy plays, but it is a little bit more difficult in minicamp, right? It's all focused on the starters, right? Everybody wants to see how Jared Goff is returning to form. Everybody's focused on Jameson Williams. Everybody's focused on Terrion Arnold and the new players or the flashy players or the starters. And at this point, there just really isn't a whole lot of news being reported about some of the depth players on this roster, and especially being the 5th to 6th wide receiver on this roster, Antoine Green just isn't going to get the media coverage until he starts playing with the 2s and 1s and until he starts making those plays consistently throughout camp. However, I do think that Antoine Green has a lot of talent. I do think he shows so many flashes, but he just needs to become consistent. He has so much talent, so many flashes on the football field. And I think that in a strong preseason, we'll see Antoine Green make some more big plays. We'll see him have another long touchdown. We'll see him make some spectacular catches. We'll see him look like a star player at times in the preseason. But the key for Antoine Green is going to be consistency. It's going to be catching the ball every time. It's going to be running every route the right way. It's going to be looking the ball in and fighting through contact and getting better with that physicality. If he can do those things, which I do think that he can, Antoine Green could be the Lions' next X wide receiver. If he gets better hands and starts catching the ball more consistently, if he gains that trust of Jared Goff and starts creating separation a little bit better, there is no reason that Antoine Green can't develop into the X wide receiver that the Detroit Lions need and have been looking for. And I do think if they can unlock Antoine Green's full potential, pairing him with Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams, with Antoine Green being the X, I do think that there will be some strong considerations for him to be a wide receiver one, for him to see more targets. And I do think that there is a chance Antoine Green can develop into that next X wide receiver. But with all of that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. That is kind of my breakdown of Detroit Lions' second-year wide receiver, Antoine Green. Again, a player with so much talent, but so little consistency. But let me know in the comments down below what you think of Antoine Green. I know a lot of people aren't nearly as high on him as me, but I would be curious to hear what you guys have to say and what you guys think, just to see where your head is at with the second-year wideout. With all of that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. Of course, let me know down in the comments below what you think about number 80 and where you think he could go in year 2. But with all of that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. If you have yet to subscribe to the channel, please go down below and do so. It helps the channel out a ton, and we are pushing for 4,100 subscribers by the start of training camp. We are growing incredibly fast. If you have yet to hit the subscribe button, please do so, as well as the bell notification, so you never miss a daily Detroit Lions video. But with all of that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, and as always, go Lions.